Salutations and welcome to my Basics of Negative Utilitarianism. Essentially, this video arose out of my need to explain and concisely point to an explanation of negative utilitarianism from a mostly unbiased perspective. Most of the videos on the internet which talk about negative utilitarianism have one of these three problems. One, they present negative utilitarianism as an obviously objectively correct form of ethics without seriously evaluating the objections, or they don't consider the objections at all. Two, they present utilitarianism by strawmanning the two alternative positions, usually virtue ethics and deontology. They clearly don't understand deontology or virtue ethics, nor the individual types of deontology and virtue ethics. Or third, they present utilitarianism without considering its nuances or the differences between the different types of utilitarianism. Some of the videos will do all three of these things, but most will do at least one. Sometimes this is done because the person behind the video has an agenda to support negative utilitarianism. Nonetheless, I'm going to present the theory of utilitarianism without strawmanning the representatives of utilitarianism. So first and foremost, I'm going to need to introduce what utilitarianism is in of itself, just the basic theory of utilitarianism and its history. After that, I'm going to present the difference and the relevant implications of believing in negative utilitarianism. The primary text with which we will be working is John Stuart Mill's Utilitarianism, Jeremy Bentham's Introduction to the Principles of Morals and Legislation, and Karl Popper's Open Society and Its Enemies. The first modern proponent of utilitarianism is going to be Jeremy Bentham, who taught John Stuart Mill, who is another one of the most influential proponents of utilitarianism. And utilitarianism basically says that utility is pleasure minus pain. The creed, which accepts as the foundation of morals utility, or the greatest happiness principle, holds that actions are right in proportion as they tend to promote happiness, wrong as they tend to produce the reverse of happiness. By happiness is intended pleasure and the absence of pain. By unhappiness, pain and the privation of pleasure. John Stuart Mill, Utilitarianism. The primary reason why people believe in utilitarianism is that it seems like if we have a choice between having a good situation or having a worse situation, we would always pick the better situation or the good situation. Under utilitarianism, acts are not intrinsically right or wrong. They are only right or wrong insofar as they lead to positive or negative consequences. Thus, there produces a distinction in utilitarianism between doing the right thing and doing the rational thing. For example, the rational thing would be to do the action which probably increases the most utility, but the right thing would be to do the action which actually does increase the most utility. This brings us to a distinction in utilitarian theory between act and rule utilitarianism. Act utilitarianism claims that we should always do the act which maximizes utility. Rule utilitarianism claims that we should follow the rule which, when acted upon, generally leads to more utility. It should be noted that there are certain situations where act utilitarianism and rule utilitarianism will say the same thing, but the morally relevant cases will be when rule utilitarianism says, for example, don't prosecute the innocent. Now, there may be some circumstances in which it seems like the right thing to do would be to prosecute the innocent on act utilitarianism. But under rule utilitarianism, if the rule which generally maximizes the most utility is to not prosecute the innocent, then you wouldn't have that unintuitive conclusion. The classic example is the police officer who has a criminal in custody that he knows is not guilty of the crime accused. However, if he does not convict that criminal, there will be an angry mob, and that angry mob will cause a sufficient amount of violence that the greater amount of utility will have been to prosecute the innocent man. Suppose that it is quite likely that the angry mob will kill several people in the pursuit of vigilante justice. It seems like under act utilitarianism, the best thing to do would be to prosecute the innocent man. However, under rule utilitarianism, if we think that generally it maximizes utility not to prosecute the innocent, then it would seem like that would lead to the more intuitive conclusion. One of the problems with this is it seems like the distinction between act and rule utilitarianism is ultimately not useful. It seems like the best possible rule for rule utilitarianism would be to do the act which maximizes the most amount of utility. For example, with the town sheriff, it would maximize more utility, at least under the traditional definitions of utility, to prosecute the innocent man in that situation. And it would still maximize utility to generally, in most circumstances, not prosecute the innocent. And since you can evaluate them on an individual basis on act utilitarianism, it's always going to turn out to have more utility under act utilitarianism than rule utilitarianism, thus making the best possible rule to follow the recommendation of act utilitarianism. The response to this is that people are generally not very good at calculating utilities. And so, if we make the utility rule that we should follow what act utilitarianism supposes, then it would have been simpler to get more accurate predictions by just positing a general rule. So there might be situations where it's not very easy or possible to calculate all utilities in the moment, and thus the rule would be more useful in determining the correct action. However, this somewhat moves the goalposts as to what would be the ideal moral theory. It seems like act utilitarianism will maximize the most utilities, especially in situations like the town sheriff, where the amount of death and destruction caused by the mob is easily calculatable. Thus, while we might have a more practical rule in rule utilitarianism, it seems like if you follow the theory to its logical conclusion, act utilitarianism is going to maximize utility better. So while it may not be the most rational choice to make, it will always be the right choice to make overall. Another important distinction is going to be between ideal utilitarianism and hedonistic utilitarianism. Ideal utilitarians tend to differ in their theory of value. Generally, ideal utilitarians consider other things besides the well-being of persons to be morally relevant or to have intrinsic value. Essentially, they might claim something like knowledge has intrinsic value, regardless of whether it actually improves anybody's well-being. For example, an ideal utilitarianism could argue that equality has intrinsic value, regardless of whether it improves the well-being of the majority of the people in the society. Another example might be justice. If justice has intrinsic value, then it seems like it would always be wrong to prosecute the innocent person, even in cases where it seems like the well-being of more people would go up. The problem with this is that it's hard to justify why anything has intrinsic value if we're talking from a consequentialist point of view. Ultimately, if these values don't help people live better lives in terms of well-being or pleasure and pain, under a consequentialist view, unlike a deontological view, it doesn't seem like there should be a reason why we value these things, other than what they mean to human persons. Now that we've kind of laid down the fundamental groundwork, I'm going to dive into negative utilitarianism. Negative utilitarianism kind of arises out of Karl Popper's Open Society and Its Enemies. In my opinion, human suffering makes a direct moral appeal, namely the appeal for help, while there is no similar call to increase the happiness of a man who is doing well anyway. A further criticism of the utilitarian formula, maximize pleasure, is that it assumes a continuous pleasure-pain scale that let us treat degrees of pain as negative degrees of pleasure. But from a moral point of view, pain cannot be outweighed by pleasure, and especially not one man's pain by another man's pleasure. Instead of the greatest happiness for the greatest number, one should demand, more modestly, the least amount of avoidable suffering for all. Negative utilitarianism seeks to avoid a lot of the unintuitive consequences of hedonistic or the more original forms of utilitarianism. For example, one of the consequences of regular utilitarianism seems to be that if we had a situation where some people are being tortured for the pleasure or benefit of others, like for example on a TV show, while it would increase the amount of pleasure compared to the small amount of pain caused or suffering caused by the TV show, it seems like the pleasure would outweigh the pain. But if we apply the metric of negative utilitarianism, where we want to reduce the amount of pain or reduce the amount of suffering, then that kind of unintuitive situation doesn't happen. Now, I'm not going to focus on a lot of the objections against utilitarianism in its traditional form, and in the form that most proponents today advocate, simply because negative utilitarianism is the focus of this video. That being said, some of the objections will have some carryover. One point of clarification is that often what will be the case to do in negative utilitarianism, what would be right to do in negative utilitarianism, will be the same in regular utilitarianism, John Stuart Mill's utilitarianism, that is. For example, Ursula Le Guin wrote a short story called The Ones Who Walk Away from Homeless. And in the story, we have this utopian-esque city called Homeless, or Homeless, and seemingly everyone has an infinite amount of pleasure, or a near infinite, a large amount of pleasure. However, that pleasure depends upon the perpetual misery of a child. Apparently the child is tortured constantly and it is in agonizing pain. Now, it seems like, at least my interpretation of the short story, is that this pain somehow makes all of the pain, or somehow provides this kind of utopian-like experience for the city. And without this, there would be a lot more suffering. So it seems like, at least in this hypothetical situation, if we can't achieve less suffering through removing the child, because that would cause more suffering on other people and things like that, we should consider the torturing of that one child to be justified in the context of the city. And that is perfectly consistent and actually in direct accordance with the principles of utilitarianism, regular utilitarianism, that is, the maximization of pleasure, minimization of pain. This leads me to a word about unintuitive situations and accepting utilitarianism. Oftentimes, it seems like and negative utilitarianism in particular, it seems like these unintuitive situations commit someone only to the unintuitive aspects of their position. So essentially they become reductios or reductios. And the person can just accept the conclusions and walk away scot-free. But if we're assuming moral realism, there has to be some connection between our intuitions and what is the truth. And even if they're not being inconsistent, we should think about the reasons why our moral intuitions don't confer, don't match with what the theory is producing. There may be cases where these situations are just impossible to evaluate practically, thus we can't trust our conclusions in that type of situation because of the absurd nature of it, or that the situation may never happen. But I think that trusting our intuitions is a generally reliable method of testing whether we should accept a moral theory. Basically what I'm saying is, if I make a reductio and it doesn't seem like it proves that the conclusion of negative utilitarianism is wrong, I recognize that and advise you not to take it as proof that negative utilitarianism is wrong. Rather, this is a reason why one might not accept negative utilitarianism. I think the first place you can kind of push negative utilitarianism is on the idea that our consequences are really what matters. There seems to be clear examples where we get the same consequences from very different actions, or where we get different consequences from the same actions. The more problematic of these is where we have different consequences from the same actions. Take an example of a drunk driver. The person goes to the bar, becomes legally intoxicated, and drives home. In the second example, the person gets legally intoxicated, we'll say to the same extent, drives home. However, before he gets home, he gets in a car crash which kills 30 people. The problem is that both of these actions seem to be the same morally. The person chose the same things, yet had different consequences. So it seems like the consequences aren't really what's relevant to the situation. It's the actual choices that they made and the internal morality of those choices within the context of their psychology. Another problem can be that you have no way to distinguish between what goes above and beyond the call of duty versus what are just moral obligations. It seems like if you push negative utilitarianism far enough, you get the conclusion that you should essentially be a suicide cult leader, that you should try to push as many people as possible to die so that you reduce the suffering of all beings by a maximal amount. Even on a less extreme reading, like let's say that we have a perfect duty to not kill ourselves, you seem to at least be committed to convincing as many people as possible to kill themselves so that they can minimize suffering by not causing more suffering via all the incidental ways which we cause suffering. This would be an example of reductio, because the person could just bite the bullet and say, yeah, then that's actually what we're committed to. A similar example would be like donating all your money to charity, right? It seems like under utilitarianism, negative utilitarianism in particular, we are morally required to donate all our money to charity because that reduces far more suffering than us having any money. I mean, there might be some in particular cases where the individual can do more reduction of suffering by advocating for the position that people should donate to charity a large amount, for perhaps 50% of their income. But I think that most would argue that most of us are not in that kind of position of having sufficient reach, that we know enough people to cause a sufficient impact that we can convince to donate a large amount to charity. So that we need to do an even larger extent, since not everybody is going to listen to us and be convinced by our arguments. Another problem is that it seems like utilitarianism in general, but negative utilitarianism as well, keeps us from having any kind of promises or from telling the truth in most circumstances. For example, if I make a promise to my son that I commit to take him to college via my money, at any point that the amount of utility shifts to where I would calculate that donating that money would better serve utility, I should do it. And similarly, in any circumstance, no matter what promises I made, they must all fall in line with the greater service of utility. So I promise you I'll meet you on Sunday, for example. But I calculate my utilitarian calculus, and it turns out that meeting you will cause more suffering than if I were to go work at a soup kitchen that whole time. Well, I obviously can't do that then. I can't meet you, and I can't make a promise. I can't make any promises that I would be able to keep, because I at any point would have to change my plans or my word. And similarly, it seems like it would result in a world where we couldn't trust anybody, because it seems like the logical conclusion of negative utilitarianism is we should lie if we think that it will cause less suffering than telling the truth in all circumstances. And obviously we have the Kantian objection to that, not just in terms of deontology, but in terms of the logical contradictions such a world would entail. But the deeper point is that anybody who tries to convince you of negative utilitarianism has a motive to lie to you about their reasons for believing utilitarianism and negative utilitarianism. Reduce the suffering that is overall in the world. Essentially, what this is going to lead to is us all being machines calculating out utilities and pushing out results, essentially, throughout our whole lives. It seems to negate the social aspect of being moral. Another problem is that it seems like negative utilitarianism doesn't recognize that not all suffering is bad. Sometimes suffering is justified. For example, we could have a world of extremely bad people. Let's say that we have a world with 99 bad people, and they all, similar to the example that I referenced before in Ursula Le Guin's short story, take immense pleasure in the suffering and torture of this one individual. But if we removed that one individual, it would cause immense suffering among all those 99 evil people. It seems like the conclusion would be, intuitively, that we should stop that suffering of the one innocent good person, regardless of the suffering it will cause on those 99 bad people. There are other ways you can question utilitarianism in general, and negative utilitarianism in particular. For example, you could question whether morality can really be based on hypothetical imperatives like Kant does in the Groundwork for the Metaphysics of Morals. However, that goes beyond the scope of this video, as I just wanted to give a brief overview of utilitarianism with a focus on negative utilitarianism while offering a few objections. So I'd like to thank you for watching this very long video, and I hope that you found it to be informative, and I hope that you have a nice day. Thank you.